Scottish Ghost Stories by Elliott O'Donnell. Case 7. Pearlin Jean of Allanbank. Few ghosts have obtained more notoriety than Pearlin Jean, the phantasm which for many years haunted Allanbank, a seat of the Stuarts. The popular theory as to the identity of the apparition is as follows. Mr. Stuart, afterwards created first Baronet of Allanbank, when on a tour in France, met a young and beautiful French Sister of Charity of the name of Jean, whom he induced to leave her convent. Tiring of her at length, Mr. Stuart brutally left her, and returning abruptly to Scotland, became engaged to be married to a lady of his own nationality and position in life. But Jean was determined he should not escape her so easily. For him, she had sacrificed everything. Her old vocation in life was gone. She had no home, no honour, nothing. So she resolved to leave no stone unturned to discover his whereabouts. At last, her perseverance was rewarded, and fortune favouring her, she arrived without mishap at Allanbank. The truth was then revealed to her. Her cruel and faithless lover was about to be wedded to another, but despair gave her energy, and burning with indignation she hastened to his house to upbraid him. She reached the spot just as he was driving out with his fiancée. With a cry of anguish, Jean rushed forward and, swinging herself nimbly onto the fore-wheel of the coach, turned her white and passionate face towards its occupants. For a moment Mr. Stuart was too dumbfounded to do anything. He could scarcely believe his senses. Who on earth was this frantic female? Good heavens! Jean! Impossible! How on earth had she got there? And the tumultuous beating of his guilty heart turned him sick and faint. Then he glanced fearfully and covertly at his fiancée. She must not know the truth at any cost. Possibly he lost his head. At all events, that is the kindest construction to put on his subsequent action, for, dastardly as his behaviour had been to Jean in the past, one can hardly imagine him capable of deliberately murdering her, and in so horrible a fashion. There was not a second to lose. An instant more and the secret that he had so assiduously hidden from the lady beside him would be revealed. Jean's mouth was already open to speak. He waved her aside. She adhered to her post. He shouted to the physician, and the huge lumbering vehicle was set in motion. At the first turn of the wheels, Jean slipped from her perch. Her dress caught in the spokes, and she was crushed to death. Her fate does not appear to have made any deep impression either on Mr. Stuart or his lady love, for they continued their drive. The hauntings began that autumn. Mr. Stuart, as was only fit and proper, being the first to witness the phenomenon. Returning home from a drive one evening, he perceived to his surprise the dark outlines of a human figure perched on the arched gateway of his house, exactly opposite the spot where Jean had perished. Wondering who it could be, he leaned forward to inspect it closer. The figure moved. An icy current of air ran through him, and he saw to his horror the livid countenance of the dead Jean. There she was, staring down at him with lurid, glassy eyes, her cheeks startlingly white, her hair fluttering in the wind, her neck and forehead bathed in blood. Paralyzed with terror, Mr. Stuart could not remove his gaze, and it was not until one of the menials opened the carriage door to assist him down that the spell was broken, and he was able to speak and move. He then flew into the house, and spent the rest of the night in the most abject fear. After this, he had no peace. Allanbank was constantly haunted. The great oak doors open and shut of their own accord at night, with loud clanging and bangs, and the rustling of silks and pattering of high-heeled shoes were heard in the oak-panelled bedrooms and along the many dark and winding passages. From her attire, which was a piece of lace made of thread, the apparition became known as Pearlin Jean, and a portrait of her was actually painted. It is recorded that when this picture was hung between one of Mr. Stewart and his lady love, the hauntings ceased, but that as soon as it was removed, they were renewed. Presumably it was not allowed to remain in the aforesaid position long, for the manifestations appear to have gone on for so many years without intermission. Most phantasms of the dead inspire those who see them with horror, and that is my own experience. But Pearlin Jean seems to have been an exception to this rule. A housekeeper called Betty Norrie, who lived for many years at Allanbank, declared that other people besides herself had so frequently seen Jean that they had grown quite accustomed to her, and were, consequently, no more alarmed at her appearance than they were by her noises. Another servant at the house, of the name of Jenny Blackadder, used constantly to hear Jean, but could never see her, though her husband did. The latter, when courting Jenny, received a rare scare, which suggests to me that Jean, in spite of her tragic ending, may not have been without a spice of humour. Thomas, for that was the swain's name, made an assignation one night to meet Jenny in the orchard at Allanbank. It was early when he arrived at the trysting place, for Thomas, like all true lovers, was ever rather more than punctual, and he fully contemplated a long wait. Judge, then, of his astonishment when he perceived in the moonlight what he took to be the well-known and adored figure of his lady love. With a cry of delight, Thomas rushed forward and, swinging his arms widely open to embrace her, beheld her vanish, and found himself hugging space. An icy current of air thrilled through him, and the whole place, trees, nooks, moonbeams, and shadows, underwent a hideous metamorphosis. The very air bristled with unknown horrors, till flesh and blood could stand no more, and, even at the risk of displeasing his beloved Jenny, Thomas fled. Some few minutes later, at the appointed hour, Jenny arrived on the scene, and no one was there. She dallied for some time, wondering whatever could have happened to Thomas, and then returned, full of grave apprehensions, to the house. It was not until the next morning that the truth leaked out, and Jenny, after indulging in a hearty laugh at her lover, who felt very shamefaced now that it was daylight, sensibly forgave him and raised no obstacle when asked to fix a day for their marriage. In after years, Jenny used to retail the story with many harrowing allusions to Pearlin Jean, whom she somewhat foolishly made use of as a bogey to frighten children into being good. A Mr. Sharp, who, when he was a little boy, was once placed in her charge, confesses that he was dreadfully scared at her stories, and that he never ventured down a passage in those days without thinking Pearlin Jean, with her ghostly blood-stained face, claw-like hands, and rustling lace dress, was after him. Nurse Jenny used to tell him that the Stewarts tried in vain to lay Jean's spirit, actually going to the length of calling in several ministers to exorcise it. But all to no purpose. It still continued its nocturnal peregrinations. In the year 1790, the Stewarts let the house to strangers, who, when they took it, had not the least idea that it was haunted. However, they did not long remain in ignorance, for two ladies, who occupied the same bedroom, were awakened in the night by hearing someone walking across the floor. The presence did not suggest burglars, for the intruder behaved in the most noisy manner, pacing restlessly and apparently aimlessly backwards and forwards across the room, swishing the floor with what sounded like a long lace train, and breathing heavily. They were both terrified and so cold that they could hear one another's teeth chatter. They were too frightened to call for help. They could only lie still, hoping and praying it would not come nearer to them. The sufferings of these two ladies were indescribable, for the ghost remained in their room all night, moving restlessly about until daybreak. It was not until some days later, when other people in the house had experienced the phenomenon, that they were told the story of the notorious Pearlin Jean. But was the so-called Pearlin Jean really the apparition of the murdered Frenchwoman? To my mind, her identity with that of the beautiful Sister of Charity has not been satisfactorily established, and I think there are reasons to doubt it. If, for instance, the apparition were that of a Sister of Charity, why should it appear incongruously attired in a long trailing gown of lace? And if it were that of a woman of the presumably staid habits of a Sister of Charity, why should it delight in mischief and play the pranks of a poltergeist? And yet, if it wasn't the ghost of Jean, whose ghost was it? Case 8. The Drummer of Cortachy. What ancient Scottish or Irish family has not its family ghost? A banshee, the heritage of Niall of the Nine Hostages, is still the unenviable possession of his descendants, the O'Donnells, and I, who am a member of the clan, have both seen and heard it several times. As it appears to me, it resembles the decapitated head of a prehistoric woman, and I shall never forget my feelings one night when, aroused from slumber by its ghastly wailing, I stumbled frantically out of bed, and groping my way upstairs in the dark, without venturing to look to the left or right, lest I should see something horrible, found every inmate of the house huddled together on the landing, paralyzed with fear. I did not see it on that occasion, but on the following morning, as I had anticipated, I received the news that a near and dear relative had died. Possessing such an heirloom myself, I can therefore readily sympathize with those who own a similar treasure, such, for example, as the famous, or rather infamous, drummer of Cortachy Castle, who is invariably heard beating a tattoo before the death of a member of the clan of Ogilvy. Mrs. Crowe, in her Night Side of Nature, referring to the haunting, says, Miss D, a relative of the present Lady C, who has been staying some time with the Earl and Countess at their seat near Dundee, was invited to spend a few days at Cortachy Castle with the Earl and Countess of Airlie. She went, and whilst she was dressing for dinner, the first evening of her arrival, she heard a strain of music under her window, which finally resolved itself into a well-defined sound of a drum. When her maid came upstairs, she made some inquiries about the drummer that was playing near the house, but the maid knew nothing on the subject. For the moment the circumstance passed from Miss D.'s mind, but reoccurring to her again during the dinner, she said, addressing Lord Airlie, "My lord, who is your drummer, upon which—" She said, addressing Lord Airlie, "My lord, who is your drummer, upon which—" "My lord, who is your drummer, upon upon which his lordship turned pale. Lady Airlie looked distressed, and several of the company, who all heard the question, embarrassed, whilst the lady, perceiving that she had made some unpleasant allusion, although she knew not to what their feelings referred, forbore further inquiry till she reached the drawing-room, when, having mentioned the circumstance again to a member of the family, she was answered, "What? Have you never heard of the drummer boy?" "No," replied Miss D. "Who in the world is he?" "Why," replied the other, "he is a person who goes about the house playing his drum, whenever there is a death impending in the family. The last time he was heard was shortly before the death of the last countess, the Earl's former wife. And that is why Lord Airlie became so pale when you mentioned it. The drummer boy is a very unpleasant subject in this family, I assure you." Miss D. was naturally much concerned, and indeed not a little frightened at this explanation, and her alarm being augmented by hearing the sounds on the following day, she took her departure from Cortachy Castle and returned to Lord C.'s, where she related this strange circumstance to the family, through whom the information reached me. This affair was very generally known in the north, and we awaited the event with interest. The melancholy death of the Countess about 5 or 6 months afterwards at Brighton sadly verified the prognostications. I have heard that a paper was found in her desk after her death, declaring her conviction that the drum was for her. Mrs. Crowe goes on to explain the origin of the phenomenon. According to legend, she says, there was once at Cortachy a drummer, who, incurring the jealousy of the then Lord Airlie, was thrust into his own drum and flung from a window of the tower, in which, by the way, Miss D. slept. Before being put to death thus, the drummer is stated to have said he would for ever after haunt the Airlie family, a threat he has obviously been permitted to fulfill. During one of my visits to Scotland, I stayed some days in Forfarshire, not far from Cortachy. Among the visitors at my hotel was a very old gentleman of the name of Porter, who informed me that, when a boy, he used to visit some relatives, who, at that time, lived within easy walking distance of Cortachy. One of these relatives was a lad of about 14 named Alec, with whom he had always been the closest of friends. The recollection of their many adventures evidently afforded Mr. Porter infinite amusement, and one of these adventures in particular, he told me, was as fresh in his mind as if it had happened yesterday. "Looking back upon it now," he said, with a far-away look in his eyes, "it certainly was a strange coincidence, and if you are interested in the hauntings of Cortachy, Mr. O'Donnell, you may perhaps like to hear the account of my ghostly experiences in that neighbourhood." Of course, I replied that nothing would give me greater pleasure, and Mr. Porter forthwith began his story. "One misty night in October, my friend Alec and I, both being keen on rabbiting, determined to visit a spinney adjoining the Cortachy estate in pursuit of our quarry. Alec had chosen this particular night, thinking, under cover of the mist, to escape the vigilance of the keepers, who had more than once threatened to take him before the laird for trespassing. To gain access to the spinney, we had to climb a granite wall and drop on the other side, the drop, in addition to being steep, being rendered all the more precarious by reason of the man-traps the keepers were in the habit of setting. When I got astride the wall and peered into the well-like darkness at our feet, and heard the grim rustling of the wind through the giant pines ahead of me, I would have given all I possessed to have found myself snug and warm in bed. But Alec was of a different kidney. He had come prepared for excitement, and he meant to have it. For some seconds we both waited on the wall in breathless silence, and then Alec, with a reckless disregard of what might be in store for him, gently let himself drop. And I, fearing more, if anything, than the present danger, to be forever after branded as a coward if I held back, timidly followed suit. By a great stroke of luck, we alighted in safety on the soft carpeting of moss. Not a word was spoken, but, falling on hands and knees and guiding ourselves by means of a dark lantern Alec had bought second-hand from the village blacksmith, we crept on all fours along a tiny bramble-covered path that after innumerable windings eventually brought us into a broad glade, shut in on all sides by lofty trees. Alec prospected the spot first of all to see no keepers were about, and we then crawled into it, and approaching the nearest burrows, set to work at once with our ferrets. 3 rabbits were captured in this fashion, and we were eagerly anticipating the taking of more, when a sensation of icy coldness suddenly stole over us, and, on looking round, we perceived to our utmost consternation a very tall keeper standing only a few yards away from us. For once, in a way, Alec was nonplussed, and a deathly silence ensued. It was too dark for us to see the figure of the keeper very distinctly, and we could only distinguish a gleaming white face set on a very slight and perpendicular frame, and a round, glittering something that puzzled us both exceedingly. Then, a feeling that perhaps it was not a keeper gradually stole over me, and in a paroxysm of ungovernable terror I caught hold of Alec, who was trembling from head to foot as if he had the ague. The figure remained absolutely still for about a minute, during which time neither Alec nor I could move a muscle, and then turning round with an abrupt movement, came towards us. Half dead with fright, but only too thankful to find that we had now regained the use of our limbs, we left our spoil and ran for our lives in the direction of the wall. We dared not look back, but we knew the figure followed us, for we heard its footsteps close at our heels, and never to my dying day shall I forget the sound, rat-tat, tat-rat-tat-tat, for all the world like the beat of a muffled drum. How we ever managed to reach the wall I could never tell, but as we scrambled over it regardless of man-traps and bruises and plunged into the heather on the other side, we heard the weird footsteps receding in the direction of the castle, and ere we had reached home the rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat had completely died away. We told no one a word of what had happened, and a few days after, simultaneously with the death of one of the Airleys, we learned, for the first time, the story of the phantom drummer. I have little doubt, Mr. Porter added in conclusion, that the figure we took to be a keeper was the prophetic drummer, for I can assure you there was no possibility of hoaxes, especially in such ill-omened guise, anywhere near the Cortachy estate. Poor old Mr. Porter, he did not long survive our rencontre. When I next visited the hotel some months later, I was genuinely grieved to hear of his decease. His story had greatly fascinated me, for I love the solitude of the pines and have myself from time to time witnessed many remarkable occult phenomena under the shadow of their lofty summits. One night, during the second visit of mine to the hotel, the mood to ramble came upon me, and, unable to resist the seductive thought of a midnight stroll across the bracken-covered hills, I borrowed a latchkey, and, armed with a flask of whisky and a fixed stick, plunged into the moonlit night. The keen, heather-scented air acted like a tonic. I felt younger and stronger than I had felt for years, and I congratulated myself that my friends would hardly know me if they saw me now, as I swung along with the resuscitated stride of 20 years ago. The landscape for miles around stood out with startling clearness in the moonshine, and I stopped every now and then to drink in the beauties of the glittering mountain ranges and silent, glimmering tarns. Not a soul was about, and I found myself, as I loved to be, the only human element in the midst of nature. Every now and then a dark patch fluttered across the shining road, and with a weird and plaintive cry, a night bird dashed abruptly from hedge to hedge and seemingly melted into nothingness. I quitted the main road on the brow of a low hill and embarked upon a wild expanse of moor, lavishly covered with bracken and white heather, intermingled with which were the silvery surfaces of many a pool of water. For some seconds I stood still, lost in contemplating the scenery, its utter abandonment and grand sense of isolation, and inhaling at the same time long and deep draughts of the delicious moorland air, unmistakably impregnated now with breaths of ozone. My eyes wandering to the horizon, I detected on the very margin of the moorland a dense clump of trees, which I instantly associated with the spinney in my old friend Mr. Porter's story. And, determining that the renowned spinney should be my goal, I at once aimed for it, vigorously striking out along the path which I thought would be most likely to lead to it. Half an hour's brisk walking brought me to my destination, and I found myself standing opposite a granite wall which my imagination had no difficulty in identifying with the wall so well described by Mr. Porter. Removing the briars and gorse prickles which left little of my stockings whole, I went up to the wall and, measuring it with my body, found it was a good foot taller than I. This would mean rather more climbing than I had bargained for, but the pines, the grim silence of their slender frames and gently swaying summits, fascinated me. They spoke of possibilities few could see or appreciate as I could. Possibilities of a sylvan phantasmagoria enhanced by the soft and mystic radiance of the moon. An owl hooted, and the rustling of brushwood told me of the near proximity of some fur-coated burrower in the ground. High above this animal life, remoter even than the tops of my beloved trees or the mountain ranges, etched on the dark firmament, shone multitudinous stars, even the rings round Saturn being plainly discernible. From the Milky Way my eyes at length wandered to the pines, and a puff of air laden with the odour of their resin and decaying brushwood decided me. I took a few preliminary sips of whisky, stretched my rusty limbs, and, placing one foot in a jagged crevice of the wall, swarmed painfully up. How slow and how hazardous was the process! I scratched my fingers. Inured to the pen, but a stranger to any rougher substance, I ruined my buck's calf boots. I split my trousers at the knees, and I felt that my hat had parted with its shape forever, and yet I continued the ascent. The end came all too suddenly. When within an ace of victory, I yielded to impulse, and with an energy the desperate condition of my skin and clothes alone could account for, I swung up, and the outer edge of the wall melted beneath me. My hands frantically clutched at nothingness. A hideous sensation of falling surged through my brain. My ears and eyes filled to bursting, and with a terrific crash that seemed to drive my head and spine right through my stomach, I met the black, uprising earth and lost consciousness. Providentially for me, I had pitched head first into a furze bush, which broke the fall. Otherwise I might have met with serious injury. As it was, when I recovered my momentary loss of consciousness, I found that I had sustained no worse harm than a severe shaking, scratches galore, and the utter demolition of my clothes. I picked myself up with difficulty, and spent some time searching for my hat and stick, which I, at length, discovered, lodged, of course, where one would least have thought of looking for them. I then took close stock of my surroundings, and found them even grimmer than I had anticipated. Though the trees were packed closely together, and there was much undergrowth, the moonbeams were so powerful, and so fully concentrated on the spinney, that I could see no inconsiderable distance ahead of me. Over everything hung a solemn and preternatural hush. I saw shadows everywhere, shadows that defied analysis and had no material counterparts. A sudden crashing of brushwood brought me to a standstill and sent the blood in columns to my heart. Then I laughed loudly. It was only a hare, the prettiest and pertest thing imaginable. I went on. Something whizzed past my face. I drew back in horror. It was a bat, merely a bat. My nerves were out of order. The fall had unsteadied them. I must pull myself together. I did so, and continued to advance. A shadow, long, narrow, and grotesque, fell across my path and sent 1,001 icy shivers down my back. In an agony of terror, I shut my eyes and plunged madly on. Something struck me in the face and hurled me back. My eyes opened involuntarily, and I saw a tree that, either out of pique or sheer obstinacy, had planted itself halfway across the path. I examined its branches to make sure they were branches, and continued my march. A score more paces, a sudden bend, and I was in an open space, brilliantly illuminated by moonbeams and peopled with countless moving shadows. One would have to go far to find a wilder, weirder, and more grimly suggestive spot. As I stood gazing at the scene in awe-struck wonder, a slight breeze rocked the tops of the pine trees, and moaning through their long and gloomy aisles reverberated like thunder. The sounds suggesting slightly, ever so slightly, a tattoo, brought with them vivid pictures of the drummer. Too vivid just then to be pleasant, and I turned to go. To my unmitigated horror, a white and lurid object barred my way. My heart ceased to beat, my blood turned to ice. I was sick, absolutely sick with terror. Besides this, the figure held me spellbound. I could neither move nor utter a sound. It had a white, absolutely white face, a tall, thin, perpendicular frame, and a small, glittering, rotund head. For some seconds it remained stationary, and then, with a gliding motion, left the path and vanished in the shadows. Again a breeze rustled through the tops of the pine trees, moaned through their long and gloomy aisles, and reverberated like thunder, rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. And with this sound beating in my ears, reaction set in, and I never ceased running till I had reached my hotel. Case 9. The Room Beyond, an account of the hauntings at Hennersley, near Ayr. To me, Hennersley is what the transformation scene at a pantomime was to the imaginative child, the dreamy child of long ago, a floral paradise full of the most delightful surprises. Here, at Hennersley, from out the quite recently ice-bound earth, softened and moistened now by spring rain, there rises up row upon row of snowdrops, hyacinths and lilies, of such surpassing sweetness and beauty that I hold my breath in astonishment, and ecstatically chant a Te Deum to the fairies for sending such white-clad loveliness, and ecstatically chant a Te Deum to the fairies for sending such white-clad loveliness. And then, Then, ere my wonder has had time to fade, it is summer. The ground opens, and there springs up on all sides a veritable sea of vivid, variegated colour, scarlet, pink, and white geraniums, red, white, and yellow roses, golden honeysuckle, bright-hued marigolds, purple pansies, pale forget-me-nots, wallflowers, sweet peas, many tinted azaleas, showy hydrangeas, giant rhododendrons, foxgloves, buttercups, daisies, hollyhocks, and heliotropes, a floral host too varied to enumerate. Overcome with admiration, bewildered with happiness, I kneel on the soft carpet of grass, and burying my face extravagantly in alternate laps of luxurious, downy, scent-laden petals, fill my lungs. And burying my face extravagantly in alternate laps of luxurious, downy, scent-laden petals, fill my lungs with soul-inspiring nectar. My intoxication has barely worn off before my eyes are dimly conscious that the soil all around me is generously besprinkled with the remains of my floral friends. I spring hurriedly to my feet, and, gazing anxiously about me, suddenly perceive the gaily nodding heads of new arrivals, dahlias, sunflowers, anemones, chrysanthemums. As I continue gazing, the aromatic odour of mellow apples from the Hennersley orchards reaches my nostrils. I turn round, and there in front of me, I see row upon row of richly laden fruit trees. Their leaves are brilliant copper in the scintillating rays of the ruddy autumn sun. I gasp for breath. The beauty of tint and tone surpasses all that I have hitherto seen. It is sublime, the grand climax of transformation. As the curtain falls with the approach of winter, I hurry to my Edinburgh home and pray for the prompt return of early spring. For many years, my aged relatives, the Misses Amelia and Deborah Harbordines, lived at Hennersley, rarest and kindest of old ladies. They were the human prototypes of the flowers both they and I loved. Miss Amelia, with her beautiful complexion, rounded form, and regal mien, suggested to my childish mind more, much more, than the mere semblance of a rose, whilst Miss Deborah, with her sprightly grace and golden hair, was only masquerading as a woman. She was in reality a daffodil. Unlike so many of the fair sex who go in for gardening, my aunts were essentially dainty. Their figures were shapely and elegant, their hands slim and soft. I never saw them working without gloves, and I have good reason to believe they anointed their fingers every night with a special preparation to keep them smooth and white. They were not, decidedly not, brainy, neither were they accomplished, never having made any special study of the higher arts, but they evinced, nevertheless, the keenest appreciation of painting, music, and literature. Their library, a large one, boasted a delightful harbourage of such writers as Jane Austen, Miss Mitford, and Maria Edgeworth, and in their drawing-room, on the walls of which art was represented by the old as well as modern masters, might be seen and sometimes heard, for the Misses Harbordines often entertained, a well-tuned Broadwood, and a buxom harpsichord. I will describe this old-world abode, not as I first saw it, for when I first visited my aunts Amelia and Deborah, I was only 1 year old, but as I first remember it, a house with the glamour of a many-gabled roof and diamond window panes. The house stood by the side of the turnpike road, that broad, white, interminable road, originating from goodness knows where in the north and passing through Ayr, the nearest town of any importance, to goodness knows where in the south. A shady avenue, entered by a wooden swing gate bearing the superscription Hennersley in neat white letters, led by a circuitous route to it, and not a vestige of it could be seen from the road. In front of it stretched a spacious lawn, flanked on either side and at the farthest extremity by a thick growth of chestnuts, beeches, poplars, and evergreens. The house itself was curiously built. It consisted of 2 stories and formed a main building and 1 wing, which gave it a peculiarly lopsided appearance that reminded me somewhat ludicrously of Chanticleer, with a solitary scant and clipped appendage. It was often on the tip of my tongue to ask my relatives the reason of this singular disparity, whether it was the result of a mere whim on the part of the architect, or whether it had been caused by some catastrophe. But my curiosity was always held in check by a strange feeling that my relatives would not like to be approached on the subject. My Aunts Amelia and Deborah belonged to that class of people, unhappily rare, who possess a power of generating in others an instinctive knowledge of dangerous ground, a power which enabled them to avert, both from themselves and the might-be offender, many a painful situation. To proceed, the nakedness of the walls of Hennersley was veiled, who shall say it was not designedly veiled, by a thick covering of clematis and ivy, and in the latter innumerable specimens of the feathered tribe found a sure and safe retreat. On entering the house, one stepped at once into a large hall. A gallery ran round it, and from the centre rose a broad oak staircase. The rooms, with 1 or 2 exceptions, opened into one another, and were large and low and long in shape. The walls and floors were of oak, and the ceilings were crossed by ponderous oak beams. The fireplaces, too, were of the oldest fashion, and in their comfortable ingle nook my aunts, in the winter, loved to read or knit. When the warm weather came, they made similar use of the deep-set window-sills, over which they indulgently permitted me to scramble onto the lawn. The sunlight was a special feature of Hennersley. Forcing its way through the trellised panes, it illuminated the house with a radiancy, a soft golden radiancy I have never seen elsewhere. My relatives seemed to possess some phenomenal attraction for the sunlight, for, no matter where they sat, a beam brighter than the rest always shone on them, and when they got up, I noticed that it always followed them, accompanying them from room to room and along the corridors. But this was only one of the many pleasant mysteries that added to the joy of my visits to Hennersley. I felt sure that the house was enchanted, that it was under the control of some benevolent being who took a kindly interest in the welfare of my relatives. I remember once, on the occasion of my customary good morning to Miss Amelia, who invariably breakfasted in bed, I inhaled the most delicious odour of heliotrope. It was wafted towards me in a cool current of air as I approached her bed, and seemed, to my childish fancy, to be the friendly greeting of a sparkling sunbeam that rested on Miss Amelia's pillow. I was so charmed with the scent that, alas! Forgetful of my manners, I gave a loud sniff, and with a rapturous smile ejaculated, "Oh, Auntie, cherry pie!" Miss Amelia started. "Dear me, child," she exclaimed, "how quietly you entered! I had no idea you were in the room. Heliotrope is the name of the scent, my dear, but please do not allude to it again. Your Aunt Deborah and I are very fond of it." Here she sighed. "But for certain reasons you would not understand, we do not like to hear the word heliotrope mentioned. Kiss me, dear, and run away to your breakfast." For the first time in my life, perhaps, I was greatly puzzled. I could not see why I should be forbidden to refer to such a pleasant and harmless subject. A subject that, looked at from no matter what point of view, did not appear to me to be in the slightest degree indelicate. The more I thought over it, the more convinced I became that there was some association between the scent and the sunbeam, and in that association I felt sure much of the mystery lay. The house was haunted, agreeably, delightfully haunted by a golden light, a perfumed, radiant light that could only have in my mind one origin, one creator, Titania. Titania, queen of the fairies, the guardian angel of my extremely aged relatives. Aunt Deborah, I said one morning, as I found her seated in the embrasure of the breakfast-room window, crocheting. Aunt Deborah, you love the sunlight, do you not? She turned on me a startled face. What makes you ask such strange questions, child? She said. Of course I like the sun. Most people do. It is no uncommon thing, especially at my age. But the sunbeams do not follow everyone, Auntie, do they? I persisted. Miss Deborah's crochet fell into her lap. How queerly you talk, she said, with a curious trembling of her lips. How can the sunbeams follow one? But they do, Auntie, they do indeed, I cried. I have often watched the bright beam of golden light follow Aunt Amelia and you in different parts of the room, and it has settled on your lace collar now. Miss Deborah looked at me very seriously, but the moistening of her eyes I attributed to the strong light. Esther, she said, laying one of her soft hands on my forehead, there are things God does not want little girls to understand. Question me no more. I obeyed, but henceforth I felt more than ever assured that my aunts, consciously or unconsciously, shared their charming abode with some capricious genie, of whose presence in their midst I had become accidentally aware, and to find out the enchanted neighbourhood of its mysterious retreat was to me now a matter of all-absorbing importance. I spent hour after hour roaming through the corridors, the copses, and my beloved flower gardens, in eager search of some spot I could unhesitatingly affirm was the home of the genie. Most ardently I then hoped that the sunbeams would follow me, and that the breeze charged with cool heliotrope would greet me as it did Aunt Deborah. In the daytime all Hennersley was sunshine and flowers, and stray where I would, I never felt lonely or afraid. But as the light waned, I saw and felt a subtle change creep over everything. The long aisles of trees that in the morning only struck me as enchantingly peaceful and shady, gradually filled with strangely terrifying shadows. The hue of the broad swaths deepened into a darkness I did not dare interpret, whilst in the house, in its every passage, nook and corner, a gloom arose that, seeming to come from the very bowels of the earth, brought with it every possible suggestion of bogey. I never spoke of these things to my relatives, partly because I was ashamed of my cowardice, and partly because I dreaded a fresh rebuke. How I suffered! How I ridiculed my sufferings in the mornings, when every trace of darkness was obliterated, and amid the radiant bloom of the trees I thought only of heliotrope and sunbeams. One afternoon, my search for the abode of the genie led me to the wingless side of the house, a side I rarely visited. At the foot of the ivy-covered walls, and straight in their centre, was laid a wide bed of flowers, every one of which was white. But why white? Again and again I asked myself this question, but I dared not broach it to my relatives. A garden all white was assuredly an enigma, and to every enigma there is undoubtedly a key. Was this garden, which was all white, in any way connected with the sunbeams and heliotrope? Was it another of the mysteries of God concealed from little girls? Could this be the home of the genie? This latter idea had no sooner entered my head than it became a conviction. Of course, there was no doubt whatever. It was the home of the genie. The white petals were now a source of peculiar interest to me. I was fascinated. The minutes sped by, and still I was there. It was not until the sun had disappeared in the far distant horizon, and the grim shadows of twilight were creeping out upon me from the neighbouring trees and bushes, that I awoke from my reverie and fled. That night, unable to sleep through the excitement caused by my discovery of the home of the genie, I lay awake, my whole thoughts concentrated in one soul-absorbing desire, the passionate desire to see the fairy of Hennersley. I had never heard of ghosts, and hear its story. My bedroom was halfway down the corridor leading from the head of the main staircase to the extremity of the wing. After I said good night, I did not see my aunts again till the morning. They never, by any chance, visited me after I was in bed. Hence I knew, when I had retired for the night, I should not see a human face nor hear a human voice for nearly 12 hours. This, when I thought of the genie with its golden beams of light and scent of heliotrope, did not trouble me. It was only when my thoughts would not run in this channel that I felt any fear, and that fear was not of the darkness itself, but of what the darkness suggested. On this particular night, for the first few hours, I was sublimely happy, and then a strange restlessness seized me. I was obsessed with a wish to see the flower garden. For some minutes, stimulated by a dread of what my aunts would think of such a violation of conventionality on the part of a child, I combated furiously with the desire. But at length, the longing was so great, so utterly and wholly irresistible, that I succumbed, and getting quietly out of bed, made my way noiselessly into the corridor. All was dark and still, stiller than I had ever known it before. Without any hesitation, I plunged forward in the direction of the wingless side of the house, where there was a long, narrow, stained window that commanded an immediate prospect of the white garden. I had seldom looked out of it, as up to the present this side of the house had little attraction for me. But all was changed now, and as I felt my way cautiously along the corridor, 1,001 fanciful notions of what I might see surged through my brain. I came to the end of the corridor. I descended 6 stairs. I got to the middle of the gallery overlooking the large entrance hall. Below me, above me, and all sides of me was darkness. I stopped, and there suddenly rang out, apparently from close at hand, a loud, clear, most appallingly clear, blood-curdling cry, which, beginning in a low key, ended in a shriek so horrid, harsh, and piercing, that I felt my heart shrivel up within me, and in sheer desperation I buried my fingers in my ears to deaden the sound. I was now too frightened to move one way or the other. All the strength departed from my limbs, and when I endeavoured to move my feet, I could not. They appeared to be fastened to the ground with lead weights. I intuitively felt that the author of the disturbance was regarding my terror with grim satisfaction, and that it was merely postponing further action in order to enjoy my suspense. To block out the sight of this dreadful creature, I clenched my eyelids tightly together, at the same time earnestly imploring God to help me. Suddenly I heard the low wail begin again, and then the echo of a far-off silvery voice came softly to me through the gloom. "It's an owl! Only an owl!" With lightning-like rapidity the truth then dawned on me, and as I withdrew my clammy fingertips from my ears, the faint fluttering of wings reached me, through an open skylight. Once again I moved on. The gallery was left behind, and I was well on my way down the tortuous passage leading to my goal, when a luminous object of vast height and cylindrical shape suddenly barred my progress. Overcome by a deadly sickness, I sank on the floor, and burying my face in my hands, quite made up my mind that my last moments had come. How long I remained in this position I cannot say. To me, it seemed eternity. I was eventually freed from it by the echo of a gentle laugh, so kind and gay and girlish that my terror at once departed, and on raising my head, I perceived that the cause of my panic was nothing more than a broad beam of moonlight on a particularly prominent angle of the wall. Heartily ashamed at my cowardice, I got up, and stepping briskly forward, soon reached the stained glass window. Pressing my face against the pane, I peered through it, and there immediately beneath me lay the flowers, glorified into dazzling gold by the yellow colour of the glass. The sight thrilled me with joy. It was sublime. My instinct had not deceived me. This was indeed the long-looked-for home of the genie. The temperature, which had been high, abnormally so for June, now underwent an abrupt change, and the chill current of air sweeping down on me from the rear made my teeth chatter. I involuntarily shrank back from the window, and as I did so, to my utter astonishment, it disappeared, and I saw, in its place, a room. It was a long, low room, and opposite to me, at the farthest extremity, was a large bay window through which I could see the nodding tops of the trees. The furniture was all green, and of a lighter, daintier make than any I had hitherto seen. The walls were covered with pictures, the mantel-shelf with flowers. Whilst I was busily noting all these details, the door of the room opened, and the threshold was gorgeously illuminated by a brilliant sunbeam, from which suddenly evolved the figure of a young and lovely girl. I can see her now as I saw her then, tall and slender, with masses of golden hair waved artistically aside from a low forehead of snowy white, finely penciled brows, and long eyes of the most lustrous violet, a straight, delicately moulded nose, a firm, beautifully proportioned chin, and a bewitching mouth. At her bosom was a bunch of heliotrope, which, deftly undoing, she raised to her nose, and then laughingly held out to me. I was charmed. I took a step forward towards her. The instant I did so, a wild look of terror distorted her face. She waved me back. Something jarred against my knee, and in the place of the room I saw only the blurred outline of trees through the yellow window panes. Bitterly disappointed, but absolutely sure that what I had seen was objective, I retraced my steps to my bedroom and passed the remainder of the night in sound sleep. After breakfast, however, unable to restrain my curiosity longer, I sought Miss Amelia, who was easier to approach than her sister, and, managing after several efforts to screw up courage, blurted out the story of my nocturnal escapade. My aunt listened in silence. She was always gentle, but on this occasion she surpassed herself. "I am not going to scold you, Esther," she said, smoothing out my curls. "After what you have seen, it is useless to conceal the truth from you. God perhaps intends you to know all. Years ago, Esther, this house was not as you see it now. It had 2 wings, and in the one that no longer exists was the bedroom you saw in your vision. We called it the Green Room because everything in it was green. Your Aunt Alicia, an aunt you have never heard of, who slept there, having a peculiar fancy for that colour. Alicia was our youngest sister, and we all loved her dearly. She was just as you describe her, beautiful as a fairy, with golden hair and violet eyes, and she always wore a bunch of heliotrope in her dress. One night, Esther, one lovely, calm midsummer night, 40 years ago, this house was broken into by burglars. They got in through the green room window, which was always left open during the warm weather. We, my mother, your Aunt Deborah, and I, were awakened by a loud shriek for help. Recognizing Alicia's voice, we instantly flew out of bed and, summoning the servants, tore to the green room as fast as we could. To our horror, Esther, the door was locked, and before we could break the lock, the ruffians had murdered her. They escaped through the window and were never caught. My mother, your great-grandmother, had that part of the house pulled down, and on the site of it she planted the white garden. Though Alicia's earthly body died and was taken from us, her beautiful spirit remains with us here. It follows us about in the daytime, in the form of a sunbeam, whilst occasionally at night it assumes her earthly shape. The house is what is generally termed haunted, and no doubt some people would be afraid to live in it. But that, Esther, is because they do not understand spirits. Your Aunt Deborah and I do. Do you think, Auntie, I asked with a thrill of joy, do you think it at all likely that I shall see Aunt Alicia again tonight? Aunt Amelia shook her head gently. No, my dear, she said slowly. I think it will be impossible, because you are going home this afternoon.